Welcome to Read and Think. This is where a book that I'm reading, certain phrases catch my eye and make me think, and I'm sharing with you. First up, Thomas Sowell in his Cultures and Conquests book. Roman Britain. What exactly do we mean by Roman Britain? Well, if we look at the island here of Britain, we could see that in the southern part is really where the Romans concentrated. They didn't really move a lot west towards Wales and other parts of the country, and they completely avoided Scotland in the far north. In fact, at one point building a wall called Hadrian's Wall to keep those pesky Scots inside their own territory. The Romans found it just wasn't worth it. So we could see that they are essentially in the southeast and eastern part of the country, which is also, interestingly enough, of course, close to the sea, where they could go to their main conquests in France and other countries. Among the other common characteristics of conquerors that marked the Roman subjugation of Britain were arrogance, greed, and brutality. In southeastern Britain, for example, the king of the Iceni died in 59 AD, leaving half of his state to the Roman emperor in hopes that this gesture would enable his heirs to enjoy the remainder in peace and the realm to remain undisturbed. But the Roman authorities in Britain confiscated the entire estate, flogged the widowed queen, Boudica, for resisting and raped her daughters. The oppression and atrocities of the Romans provoked a massive revolt of the Iceni, led by Boudica and joined by other tribes with grievances against their Roman overlords. The rebellious Britons rampaged through the southern part of the island, spreading death and destruction to Romans, Roman sympathizers, and Roman structures and symbols. Eventually, however, enough Roman military units were assembled to confront the Britons, who nevertheless had great numerical superiority. After seesaw battles in which neither side showed mercy or took prisoners, once again the superior discipline, organization, and armaments of the Romans prevailed. They then slaughtered the old as well as the young, men, women, children, and animals, throwing human and animal bodies on a common pile of corpses. The Romans here were conquerors, plain and simple. They sought to dominate, so the gesture by the Iceni king meant nothing to the Romans at all, at least the ones governing at that time. And so they just took what they wanted and suppressed and murdered anybody in their way. So today that would be a clash of cultures. What cultures have no sense whatsoever of compassion and which ones do? And how do these conflict and how will they be treated? So at which point do you look at a culture and say, well, they don't have the same values as us? And in a way, that's what happened to the king of the Iceni and his widow Boudica and his daughters. And then we could see that the Romans themselves had superior discipline, organization, and armaments. Indeed, the ferocity of the Roman legions was well known throughout the world, and that reputation helped them in conquering peoples to be completely wiped out and destroyed brutally, or to give in and surrender yourself to the Romans. The Roman authorities in Britain who provoked the Boudican revolt were replaced by men who could maintain Rome's rule without such ruinous costs. In the centuries that followed, the Romans conquered Britain culturally as well as militarily. Well-to-do Britons began to wear the Roman toga, speak Latin, and have arcades, baths, and sumptuous banquets. However, this Romanization spread unevenly down the social scale, with most Britons continuing to speak in a Celtic tongue, for example. As with other conquered peoples, it was the higher classes among the Britons who had the greatest tendency to adopt the language and culture of the conquerors, thereby acquiring some of the prestige of the dominant culture and such opportunities as existed to achieve favored positions. What's interesting here is that the Romans decided that it was costing them too much money to own the province and the area of Roman Britain, at least when they were in revolt and expending so much money for soldiers and armaments, and no trade was happening during this period of revolt. And so they readjusted their strategy. But also what happened is that there became differences of classes. While you might have a king of the Iceni, you also had the, let's say, merchants or minor nobles who wanted favors with their conquerors. So they adapted and adopted their ways. And that includes the language, and that includes the social graces of wearing the toga and other types of acceptance into the Roman social life to do business with them. So again, economics is driving a change to the culture and dividing the native Britons from the Romans by further dividing the natives into a couple different types of classes, accessibility, and education levels. That's something we see over and over again throughout history, no matter the conqueror and no matter who the time period, it seems. In short, conquest created language differences and accentuated cultural differences among the conquered people. Under the Romans, towns developed, roads were built, and trade flourished. The more efficient Roman plow was used for farming. Pottery and metalwork were imported, and new building methods were used and taught. Window panes were introduced by the Romans. So were such mundane items, things as latrines. Architecture made its first real appearance as the Britons, used to huts, now for the first time saw buildings. Sculpture and representational art in general were also introduced into a country where art before had met Celtic designs. Roman capital helped build the British economy. Like other less developed regions, Britain was an exporter of raw materials. So the conquerors had a number of ways to divide the native people. One was through military strength and their particular rule of law. The other was cultural, and the other was linguistic, and the other, I would say, is trade. If you actually adhere to Roman law, you probably flourished. And here we also had the Romans come in when the Britons were living in huts and put up these magnificent buildings. I had to look up the fact that window panes were introduced by the Romans, because in the modern area we think everything was invented in the last 100 years. And actually the research indicated that as far back as Mesopotamia, 4,500 years ago, there was some type of crude window pane being made using sand, something called a flexing agent, I believe, and another material, I think lime. So whatever that was, it must have appeared to the Britons to almost be magic. The fact that you could build a road and the road could be used for carts that would enable more and more trade is something that was stunning. The farming and the fact that the more efficient Roman plow increased the food yield also meant that there was food security for probably a lot of native tribes that went hungry in the winter, and perhaps they could store this food. So there's a lot of things that were happening where the Romans were, despite being rather brutal conquerors, making things more efficient for the native peoples. I have to think that if here you were one of these native Britons living in a hut and you saw a Roman villa for the first time, it would be absolutely stunning. The window panes would appear like magic. and a number of other things, like even art would be a stunning surprise to have captured the human form. So it's kind of fascinating to see what effect that would have when you are going in and conquering a people that is literally multiple levels below the sophistication of the conquering civilization. In Winston Churchill's words, we owe London to Rome. The importance of the Roman cultural contribution to the development of Britain was demonstrated not only by the progress that took place while they were there, but also by the retrogression that took place after they left. Churchill was indeed right that they owed London to Rome. It was called Londinium and established as a port on the Thames. This is so the Romans could trade raw materials in some other part of the empire or export it back to Rome or whatever the trade route was. And when we look at the cultural impact of Rome there, and the word retrogression stands out, because in numerous instances when a conqueror leaves, then the previously conquered people don't maintain or utilize the existing infrastructure, and it falls into disrepair or back into old ways which were not as efficient or induced as much economic activity or trade. And by that, we mean also that there's certain prosperity and abundance going on with this trade that improves the quality of people's lives. Sowell is an economist by nature, but he doesn't just look at it as raw math. What he does is see how does a particular economic structure influence human behavior and social behavior. So when we had, let's say, minor nobles and merchants, they actually wanted to learn Latin and dress as Romans to be accepted so they could do more business. They could sell more goods, get favorable terms, etc. So when you had the Romans there, you had this kind of structure, and even though indeed they were quite brutal about enforcing it, they did have a structure that benefited these people in regards to trade and civilizational order to some degree. We will see this term retrogression again and again as we examine future works here